It's a great pleasure today to talk to you about our work that we're doing in terms of preparedness for both foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. I've taken on a role to coordinate our preparedness, and just a bit of background to myself. I've been working in livestock research and development for nearly 40 years, mostly with DPIRD, and in that time had a lot to do with the industry and the supply chain. More recently, I've been working with COVID response, so co-managing the response to COVID in terms of DPIRD and also industry. And again, that's given me a good understanding of the supply chain and the implications of disruption to the supply chain. So a few months ago, I was asked to take on the role to coordinate our preparedness for both foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. At the outset, I want to make it quite clear that this is not work that we've just started. We have been preparing for both of these conditions for some time. Also, this is not about the response. We're preparing, but we don't have either foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease. So on the left-hand side, this is the structure of our team within DPIRD. We have our animal biosecurity and welfare team, so that is mostly our veterinarians and biosecurity officers, and they are dealing primarily with the technical aspects of both conditions and liaising very closely with our Commonwealth and other state jurisdictions. We have our incident and emergency management team, and they are very much looking at the response and what the response might entail and involve. And they are also involved in other incidents at the same time. We have our trade and economic team, and as you'll see with foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, the greatest impact in terms of finance and in economics is on the loss of trade, immediate loss of trade to our international markets. And so we're doing some modelling in that space just to look at what the impact that might be on our state economy and in our regions. We have close contacts with our regional officers through our DPIRD staff and our regional development commissions to keep us in touch with what's happening in the regions and to feed information out to our regional colleagues and producers. Communication is a really important part, and the next slide will look at that in more detail. And on that one, down the bottom, we have our DPIRD and industry group. So this is a task group that has been formed several months ago, and we use that as a way of interacting with industry associations. So information liaison is important. As I said, at the top is the Commonwealth. They're heavily involved with our biosecurity team. Our Chief Veterinary Officer interacts on a regular basis with counterparts around the state, other states and the Commonwealth. We have close liaison with our local government, for example. So we've done webinars with local government association because in the instance of any occurrence, local governments, the relevant local governments will play an important role. The State Emergency Management Group is aware of the risks imposed by both lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease, and they are prepared and ready to step up, and that involves the relevant state departments, state government organisations such as police and DFS, etc. We're doing a lot of liaison with producers through meetings, forums, webinars, etc. So that they are very aware of what they can do on their own properties in terms of improving their biosecurity and therefore minimising the risk of either of these conditions or diseases coming onto their property. And the supply chain is important. So we've had webinars, for example, with the processing sector, and we've got meetings coming up with the Livestock Transport Association and the sale yards, because all of those groups will play an important role. We have support organisations, so I've already mentioned DFS, and DFS, we have a member of staff from that organisation now working with us on secondment. The Department of Communities, we have met with them, and they're going to play a key role in terms of health and wellbeing, because one of the impacts I've already spoken about with foot and mouth disease in particular is an economic impact, The other impact is very much about the mental health and the impact that this has not only on farmers but also on community. And so we need to be prepared to support those that are actually working in the response, but also looking at the response in terms of community and farmers when if this ever does happen. And finally, we're working with utilities, and this is primarily with the organisations such as Western Power, for example, who need access to farm properties to check on power poles, etc. But how can that be done if there is an increased biosecurity risk? So in terms of communication, we have been producing for the last several weeks an industry email, a weekly industry email that goes out to all producers who have registered livestock. And it also goes to key organisations and the processing sector, for example. So anyone is welcome to contact us if they want access to that industry email. And it gives an update on what we're doing and what's been happening at a national level as well. There is the DPIRD website, which has frequently asked questions. It has a number of biosecurity resources on there. And it also has links to other important websites. So Animal Health Australia, for example, has a lot of good information on their website, and there are links to that you can look at. We're conducting a lot of briefings, so our veterinarians are working closely with the private veterinarians around the state, briefing them on both diseases, as they will be an important, they are playing an important role now in terms of observing animals and making sure that if there's anything that needs to be reported, can be reported as soon as possible. And they will also play an important role if we get to the need for a response. We have been running a number of forums around the state and in both run by DPIRD, but also in conjunction with other private organisations. Social media is important, and so we have targeted a number of areas in terms of social media on Facebook and Twitter, for example. And we've been working closely with the International Airport to understand what they're doing in terms of their increased attention to incoming travellers, in particular from Indonesia, in terms of looking at increased surveillance of luggage. And you'd all be aware then of the mats that have now gone in. We've also put up some extra signage in domestic airports just to remind travellers of the importance of biosecurity. And finally, we've produced over 1,000 now farm biosecurity signs that are free to producers to put on their farm gate, their main farm gate. And these have been available through our DPIRD offices and Elders and Nutrient. So this is some of our communication material. The one on the left there is Be a Biosecurity Aware Travellers. So just warning people that this is not just about foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease, although they are the two that have got the most attention. But in general, it's a good opportunity to look at what you can do as a community member in terms of increasing our awareness of biosecurity. And in foot and mouth disease, the most likely source or risk of that entering the country is via pigs being fed illegal swill or meat products that have come from overseas. And so everybody's got a role to play in making sure that that doesn't happen. So we've been running forums, and then on the right-hand side there, you can see an example of what we've got on our website. So for further information, as I mentioned, the DPIRD website, there's an emergency animal disease hub, which I would encourage people to look at. You can register for those weekly emails. There's the frequently asked questions and biosecurity resources. So there's a heap of information available from our own organisation and from the national bodies in terms of what you can do to minimise the risk of both lumpy skin disease and foot and mouth disease entering into Australia. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the presentation on foot and mouth disease and lumpy skin disease. My name is Michelle Roden and I'm the Chief Veterinary Officer for Western Australia. In this presentation, we'll go through the clinical signs of both diseases, how Australia responds to them, and the actions that you can take to help protect your property and your business. Foot and mouth disease is present in a number of countries across the world, but recently, in April 2022, Indonesia confirmed an outbreak of lumpy skin disease, and fairly quickly after that, there was also a detection of foot and mouth disease in Indonesia in May 22. Both of these diseases have enhanced the risk of these two diseases entering Australia. In Indonesia, 24 provinces have reported foot and mouth disease, with 14 currently having active FMD as of the 9th of September this year. Indonesia is rolling out a foot and mouth disease vaccination program, and Bali does not have any active cases, with the last reported case on the 1st of August 2022. So a number of the provinces, 10 of the 24 originally reported, no longer are reporting active foot and mouth disease, which is really good outcome for our near neighbours. Some of the actions that have been implemented at the border by the Commonwealth has included enhanced border controls for incoming passengers, imported cargo and mail items, enhanced communication at the international airports, implemented importation certification which is aligned with the status of the relevant country. Therefore, for Indonesia, their FMD-free status has been suspended. Implementation of disinfectant mats at international airports and testing of foot and mouth disease risk products from at-risk countries detected at international airports and mail gateways. Screening mail from at-risk countries by X-ray and detector dogs, and enhanced biosecurity for returning livestock vessels. All of these measures are further reducing the risk of foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease entering Australia. So what is foot and mouth disease? FMD is a highly contagious viral disease of cloven-hooved animals. So sheep, cattle, pigs, alpacas, camels, buffalo. It's highly infectious, and the most common way it is spread is from animal to animal contact. So basically animals moving around, which is why our traceability system is so important and why movement controls play such a significant role in containing the disease. It's also present in animal products, meat and milk. And this is an important aspect of containing the disease. These products remain safe to eat and there are no food safety concerns, but there may be movement controls on animal products to contain disease spread. It can also be spread mechanically on hands, feet and clothing. This is by far a much lesser mechanism, but it's important when you have a response underway with people moving between potentially infected properties. It's also important if you're returning from overseas and you've had direct contact with animals that may be at risk of having foot and mouth disease. And airborne spread can also be important, particularly in certain environments, cooler environments with density of air particles. And so it can spread on cool, very foggy mornings and drift down between properties potentially that way. It's not occurred in Australia since 1872. However, it is increasingly spreading towards Australian northern ages, with Indonesia reported in May 22. Most likely to enter Australia through illegal importation of meat and dairy products and swill feeding of those products to pigs. This is why swill feeding in Australia is illegal and you cannot feed milk or contaminated products to pigs. Fragments of the virus, so these are not necessarily infectious, have previously been detected in confiscated product. So if a product has been heated to a particular temperature, the virus may well be inactivated, but certainly fragments have been detected in product and in product that we would expect to have been treated to a degree that it is no longer a viable virus. It is the biggest single threat to Australia's livestock and livestock product export markets, not only because of the risk of it entering Australia, but the consequence of the outbreak, because we are an exporting country and exports would be severely impacted. ABARES estimates the direct economic loss of $80 billion over 10 years, with the majority of those costs being in trade and some being in response costs. A number of countries around the world have foot and mouth disease. The dark green countries here are members that are recognised, members and zones that are recognised as being FMD-free without vaccination, and Australia is one of those. Those in the lighter green are areas which are recognised as being FMD-free with vaccination. The burgundy area, those that have recently had their suspension of FMD-free status because of an outbreak. And those in grey are those that countries and zones that without an official status for foot and mouth disease recognised by the OIE. So the clinical signs vary significantly from relatively inapparent to severe, with the most common vesicles or blisters in the mouths, nostrils, teats, or on the feet. So you'll have slobbering or drooling animals with a varying degree of lameness and reluctant to move. You do get a severe depression and lack of appetite, and in dairy animals, a significant drop in yield just before they start to develop clinical signs and through their clinical disease. You can get abortions in pigs. Cattle are very susceptible to infection, especially through aerosol. So they've got large respiratory system. They draw in a lot of air and they are very susceptible to aerosol and tend to show significant clinical signs with lameness, vesicles on their nose, mouth, teats and feet. Pigs are the major amplifying host. They're most likely to be infected by eating or ingesting contaminated or infected feed, including illegal importation of product if that was fed to them. And so they do develop large amounts of virus, and so spread from an infected piggery can be quite rapid and widespread by aerosol. Sheep are what we would call the silent spreaders. They tend to have mild or no clinical signs, and they play an important role in the spread because people are not aware that they actually have the disease. It's important to know that foot and mouth disease is not a human health risk, and it is not the same as hand, foot and mouth disease that we often hear reported in younger children in general. Now, if we turn our attention to lumpy skin disease, this is a serious viral pox disease that affects cattle and water buffalo, primarily spread by biting insects such as biting flies and mosquitoes. And these vectors that spread that are ubiquitous really across Western Australia and Australia, so present in both the north and the south. And ticks can play a role, but it's not really fully understood what type of role they play and how significant that is. It's never occurred in Australia, but again, it's an emerging threat recently reported in March 22 in Indonesia. An incursion in Australia would have significant consequences. Loss of international markets for live cattle, meat and dairy would be significant, including hides, animal welfare issues, and production losses in classes of animals as well. There are significant challenges for controlling this disease because it's vector-borne, so you need to control the biting flies as well as have livestock movement controls in place, and vaccinations are not available or registered for use in Australia. And Australia is currently working through this, looking to have a supply of vaccine that we can access and use in the event of an emergency disease outbreak. So what does LSD look like? It varies significantly, with the European or British breeds most likely to be severely impacted, with buffalo or the tropical breeds showing mild to moderate signs or potentially very few signs in buffalo. Again, they have fever and reluctance to move, nodules on the skin, not necessarily to the extent of the one in this picture, loss of condition, some level of mortality, mainly in young calves and weaners, and an affection rate or infection rate around morbidity, so the number infected, of between 5 and 45% of animals may be impacted. And that obviously depends on the level of biting flies in the region. So what are the pathways of these diseases into Australia? FMD is most likely to come in through import of contaminated products, and hence all of the importation restrictions on products coming into Australia and it being illegal to import certain products in from different countries. There is also a risk that coming in through contamination of clothing, vehicles or equipment where someone has been on an infected property and comes directly from there to Australia and hasn't taken any precautions to wash down their clothing or have a shower or anything on the way in. Lumpy skin disease can also come in through contaminated products, and that would again be an illegal pathway, potentially an insect hitchhiking on a returning livestock vessel or a plane, and also through windborne spread of insects. So most of these pathways are what we call mitigated. So they've got risk mitigation processes in place where you have to declare and tell people at the border where you've been and whether you've got any of these products. But the windborne spread of insects is not mitigated, can't be mitigated, and therefore that is one of the pathways we're most concerned about. So what's the probability of foot and mouth disease or lumpy skin disease outbreak occurring in Australia in the next 5 years? So an expert panel looked at these two diseases in 21 and again in 2022. And in 21, foot and mouth disease was considered a probability of around 9% occurring in the next 5 years, and that had moved to 11.6% in the next 5 years when it was redone in 2022. And that's because most of the pathways for foot and mouth disease to enter Australia are mitigated. Lumpy skin disease was considered to be around an 8% probability of occurring in the next 5 years, and that had moved to 28% in 2022. And again, that's because the pathway in being windborne spread across into the north of Australia is largely something that can't be mitigated. So I'll just give you a snapshot of foot and mouth disease outbreak in the United Kingdom in 2001. So the entry pathway there was considered to be most likely swill feeding of pigs. And by the time it was confirmed on the 20th of February in 2001 in an abattoir, at least 57 farms were infected at the time of this detection. It hadn't been detected for several weeks, and the spread had occurred mainly through sale yards and the movement of animals. As part of the response, the UK destroyed greater than 6.5 million animals on more than 2,000 farms over the 7 months that it took them to undertake the response, with compensation to those animals and products destroyed of approximately 2.4 billion. The cost, however, of the outbreak was significantly greater than that, with 15 to 18 billion in direct and indirect losses. At the height of the crisis, more than 10,000 vet soldiers and field and support staff, assisted by many others, were working on fighting the disease, with up to 100,000 animals slaughtered and disposed of each day in what was a massive and complex logistical operation. The response costs of that operation was approximately 2.7 billion, but the losses of affected industries and tourism was closer to 10.4 billion. Importantly to note, foot and mouth disease in the UK is not a primary exporter compared to Australia, where we export the majority of our products, certainly in Western Australia. And so their losses, I guess, were from trade restrictions and trade losses were not as impactful as potentially what that would be in WA. So I guess what this tells us is early detection and early reporting really leads to the most effective response. And we have very significant networks with government, rural and industry working together through significant disease investigation programs and running workshops to make sure they're aware of clinical signs and how to report. But it really comes back to producers in the supply chain recognising unusual signs in livestock and calling a vet or calling someone to actually investigate that and recognising it really early. Australia has two significant pieces of response arrangements that have been in place since the UK outbreak. The first one is they put in place the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, or commonly known as the EADRA, which is an agreement by government and national livestock industry organisations that provides certainty of funding for the actual response. It involves industry at the table of both the technical working group, the Consultative Committee of Emergency Animal Disease, and the decision-making funding group, the National Management Group. And industry sit on both of those committees and have a say in the decision-making process. It commits signatories, and there's a list of them there, to the prevention, preparedness and response obligations. And your national industry represents you in not only in all of the preparedness activities that go on, and there's recently been a complete rewrite of both the Lumpy Skin Disease Manual and the Foot and Mouth Disease Manual. And the Lumpy Skin Disease Manual is back up on the website with the new manual there, and the Foot and Mouth Disease one will be up in the next few weeks. The AusVet plan is the agreed structure and arrangements which go through how we respond, and it's a guidance document. And as I said, the Lumpy Skin Disease AusVet plan manual has recently been reviewed and put up, but there's a number of manuals there. It talks about compensation and valuation. It talks about the dairy industry and how things would work in the dairy industry. So I suggest you go to Animal Health Australia and look at the manuals that are available. I give you a really good understanding of how the disease response work and the mechanisms that the national industry work with to actually be part of these arrangements. So how would an outbreak play out in any state in Australia? So firstly, there's the confirmation of the diagnosis. So somebody has reported, it's been brought into our laboratory. We do some preliminary testing here, and we confirm the diagnosis at the Australian Centre of Disease Preparedness. So two laboratories confirming the diagnosis. We then put in place the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement, and for foot and mouth disease, it's a Category 2 disease, which means that government is paying 80% of the cost-sharing arrangements and industry 20%. And these costs are recovered at a national level through industry levels after the event. For lumpy skin disease, it's actually a Category 3 disease, so that's categorised as 50% industry and 50% government. The AusVet plan then guidance document is put into play, and so that would give us the guide of how the disease may play out, and depending on the unique circumstances of an outbreak, things may be contextualised or will be contextualised to that outbreak. To prevent further spread, we're looking at having statewide movement controls in place while we understand where animals may have moved in the immediate last 2 weeks. We're looking at quarantining properties that we know were high-risk traces, and we're looking at putting local area movement constrictions in place in case that there's infected properties and we need to control product or other product apart from just the livestock movements. Importantly, we need to find all the cases and trace the movements to and from the properties, and critical that we have our traceability systems up to date and current, so that we can trace where animals have been really quickly, and you've all got obligations under that space. And then we'll be undertaking surveillance on those traced properties or those that report, to investigate if there's disease on any of those properties and to contain the disease if there is. If there is disease on a property, then there will be valuation of product and animals that are ordered for destruction on that property, and then destruction, disposal and decontamination of the property, with an aim of getting these activities undertaken in a short period of time, at least to get the animals destroyed so they're not adding to the viral aerosol load that's there. Vaccination can play a role in an outbreak, and depending on the actual outbreak, the Consultative Committee of Emergency Animal Disease will decide if they use vaccination or not. And then when the last case is found, then Australia then moves to a proof of freedom phase to do enough surveillance to be able to convince the World Organisation Animal Health of our case, that we've done enough surveillance, that we don't have the disease, to return to trade. And this is a minimum of 3 months if we don't use vaccination after the last case, but a dossier needs to be submitted. And historically, it takes much longer than that for the dossier to be accepted and trading partners to start to negotiate to trade with the country as well. So absolute minimum would be 3 months, and much more likely to be significantly longer than that. So vaccination, not used in peacetime, so not used before we have a disease here, because we are recognised as being free without vaccination, and if we used it, it would impact our FMD status and therefore impact our export markets. But in responses, it has been successfully used in many parts of the world to control the spread of disease, and Australia maintains flexibility for the technical decision makers to determine if there is a role for vaccination and how it would be used in a specific outbreak scenario. And as such, we have a contract for supply of certain antigens for the Australian FMD vaccine bank, which will provide vaccine within 10 days of notification of the vaccine of the FMD strain. And we already have in place important emergency permits to be able to use it in those scenarios. I talked briefly about proof of freedom. If we do use vaccination and we don't cull the vaccines, then that minimum time period before we can start to collate the dossier of evidence that we no longer have the disease is extended to 6 months. So we're still, if we vaccinate and we cull the vaccinates, it's a minimum of 3 months. If we do a stamp out policy without vaccine, it's a minimum of 3 months. But if we don't cull the vaccinates, then it's a minimum of 6 months. But as I said at the start, you know, the time frame to get trading partners and to recognise the status and to actually present that dossier can be significantly longer. So compensation, one of the most common questions we get asked is compensation provided in a response? So compensation is provided by governments to the legal owners of livestock or livestock product or any other thing that is ordered for destruction as part of the official EAD response. So if animals are ordered for destruction or feed or some other meat product, for instance, they will be valued and compensated. And the EADRA details the nationally agreed arrangements for cost sharing of compensation. So whether it's 80-20, etc., paid to affected livestock owners. The owner gets the full cost, it's just how it's actually paid for. Compensation is done under state and territory legislation, and the process involves evaluation of the livestock that have been destroyed, followed by the owner making a claim. There will be significant disruption because of trade losses, and these are not compensatable under the Emergency Animal Disease Response Agreement. There will be, most likely, relief arrangements under the national and state emergency disaster relief arrangements to support industry through what will be a very difficult time. So what can you do? The Commonwealth has in place significant border international market restrictions to mitigate largely the risk of FMD coming into the country. But there will be illegal imports and there will be people that don't declare potentially. That then needs to get into livestock somewhere in Australia. And so your farm biosecurity plan is what we call the second phase of mitigation that is in the hands of each individual producer. So making sure that you have farm signage to be clear about your arrangements of people coming onto your property, to have protocols for yourself and staff who visited overseas and what they need to do before they can be associated with your livestock on your farm, to make sure you're recording all your movements on and off in associate and undertaking your traceability requirements, isolating introduced animals for a minimum of 7 days, including animals that have just been to a show, putting in place mechanisms to minimise the risk of stray animals, keeping your registration details of your property up to date on the brands database, fencing off your dump sites to remove access to feral pigs, being clear that you understand the guidelines around school feeding on your property, and maintaining good records so that that you can be very clear where your animals have gone and any product or visitors that have come to you. So one of the biggest impacts will be regional and community impacts. We've got things in place that I've talked about, the ADRA cost sharing and compensation arrangements that are there, but these don't deal with consequential loss and don't deal with trade. There will be producers that leave the industry, and there will be genetic loss out of the industry. The related industries, though, at a community and regional level, impact would be significant, with support industries like livestock agents, contractors and transport severely impacted, and that's where we're looking at state and national disaster relief arrangements. Non-livestock businesses are also, it's an all integrated system in local communities, and non-livestock businesses will also be impacted. Human health and wellbeing is a really important part. It's a very difficult time, and there will be some significant mental health, but even in the situation that you're not dealing with an actual response in Western Australia just because of the loss of markets in the country. So biosecurity is everyone's business. So what can you do? Be aware of what foot and mouth disease and LSD look like. Report any signs of these diseases. There's an EAD hotline that you can report to, 1800 675 888. Report to your regional DPIRD field veterinary officer or your private veterinarian. They both know really well the mechanisms for getting samples and getting them tested and reporting in WA. Have good biosecurity practices on your property. Make sure that these are well entrenched and that they're clear to people that might be coming onto your farm. Make sure your livestock traceability is up to date. Understand and ensure that the requirements are met, and do them in a timely way. And be aware and communicate to the general community that it is illegal to feed meat, animal products to pigs, swill feeding. It's illegal throughout Australia, and it is the most high-risk pathway for entry of FND into Australia. So thank you for joining me today in this presentation. I hope it is of some value, and there is a lot of material on the DPIRD website around foot and mouth disease and different fact sheets and links to all the websites available. So please go and have a look at those. Thank you very much.